Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by Curiosity Stream. So before I start, I want to say right up front that there will be spoilers. So after a few years of speculation, rumors, and leaks, Spider-Man No Way Home is finally here. And I knew it was going to be big, but just looking at how these first weekend box office results are shaking out, I don't think I was expecting it to be as huge as it is. It has been a pretty bad year for theaters, but apparently people are very willing to show up for the webhead. But does the movie deserve it? I guess I'll just say my opinion right up front, absolutely. While not without its flaws, Spider-Man No Way Home is the movie I was hoping for coming off of Far From Home. When people talk about this film, the conversation is usually about the returning Spider-Man, the old villains, the Doctor Strange connections, but strip away all the bells and whistles from this movie, and I think you're still left with a classic Spider-Man story. A story that sees Peter Parker forced to deal with things going horribly wrong and having to make brutal sacrifices as a result. The MCU Peter Parker has faced a lot of criticism through the years. That he's a spoiled rich kid sidekick, that his adventures are too bubblegum compared to his predecessors. Some of those criticisms I felt were pretty overblown or unfair, and some I think had some truth to them. But I think this movie specifically did a great job of addressing those criticisms. Peter Parker loses almost everything in this film. His aunt, his home, his friends, and the future that he had planned for himself. All the result of decisions that he felt were the morally right thing to do. Those are obviously not the only kind of Spider-Man stories that can be told, but I do think sacrifice tends to be the cornerstone of this character, which the film manages to reinforce and underline. That's something I do want to dig into in this video, but first let's talk about the movie as a whole, what really worked along with what didn't. So there is a lot of returning actors here, from past Spider-Man movies, from other MCU movies, even from Netflix shows. And one thing that I was really impressed with is how well these performances worked, even when they were playing characters initially conceived for a show or movie with a completely different tone. Maybe that doesn't sound like a big deal, but I don't think it should be underestimated. Alfred Molina and especially Willem Dafoe are really good here in what could have easily amounted to easy paycheck roles. The comedy in No Way Home is very different tonally from the comedy in Spider-Man 2, but Molina never feels out of step here, managing to fit the MCU's more verbally comedic tenor without undercutting what made his performance so tragic in the earlier film. Even Tobey Maguire, who's often accused of being a fairly limited actor, I think does some really solid work here. I'm not gonna lie, as much as the idea of the 3 live-action Spider-Men on screen sounded like a good time, I was also very nervous going in. These are drastically different Peter Parker performances from 3 very different actors, and I thought there was a decent chance that they'd have maybe one awkward scene together and then a big battle. And while this movie definitely does contain that big third act Marvel fight, Maguire and Garfield actually have a lot more screen time than I expected. And more than that, these performances don't feel like bored, obligatory cameos at all. Garfield, I feel like it's especially good. Sure, the spine of his story is pretty simple here, and maybe a little too literal, with him diving to save MJ, bringing him a bit of closure for how he failed to save Gwen Stacy. That's not exactly super emotionally complex screenwriting, but Garfield elevates it. He's a well-trained British theater actor, very good at playing the sweeping emotional scenes and the fast-paced punchlines. And I thought a lot of the most funny moments in the film came from him. Honestly, this made me want to see him return to the role again in some form. Not take over for Holland, but maybe show up in a Spider-Verse, or a Venom sequel, maybe a Spider-Gwen movie. The guy is just a rock-solid Spider-Man whose films were completely mismanaged by Sony. And if he has any interest in reprising the role of Peter Parker, I think he should get to. I also liked how this Peter feels a little insecure next to the other Spider-Man here, talking about how he felt like he was the lamest one while the others reassure him that he's not. It was a good moment in a movie that felt like a real redemption for his take on the character. How the movie uses Maguire is really smart too. While I would have liked to have learned a little bit more about his life now, we really only get one vague allusion to how him and MJ are still together. It's a very minor complaint, but I think there is a small missed opportunity there. When Holland's Peter asked the others about the villains they faced, I think it would have been really interesting to hear something that happened years after the Raimi films, like Maguire's Peter having fought Kraven the Hunter or Hydro Man or something, just to establish that yeah, some real time has passed for Peter and he's quite a bit older now. But they do give him one of my favorite moments in the film, stopping Holland's Peter from stabbing Norman Osborn to death with this glider. Not only was that a great scene just on its own, it also felt pretty perfect for Maguire's Peter, who lives with a regret of how he reacted to Uncle Ben's death. On a lighter note though, I think these guys just all played off each other really well, with a laid-back chemistry that could have felt forced, but I think managed not to. At least on that front, it really exceeded my expectations. Not that this screenplay is perfect or anything. I groaned at Osborn saying he's something of a scientist himself, in what felt like a really pandering and obvious reference to the meme. There were a few moments like that sprinkled here and there, but I think in Dafoe's case, it was easier to overlook because he was just having such a good time. There's a lot of returning bad guys here, but the Green Goblin really emerges as the true villain of the film, and Dafoe makes the most of it. They made the very wise choice to ditch his costume and mask early on, which I was happy about because while I love the first Spider-Man, that costume was never a favorite of mine. Dafoe is not wearing green face paint or anything, but his tattered clothes, and more importantly, Dafoe's expressive face, are more than enough to sell the Goblin here. The man is simply one of the best actors of his generation, and it's obvious that he had a great time returning to one of his biggest blockbuster roles. There is one thing with Norman that I found kind of odd. I don't think it's really a criticism necessarily, but the characterization of Norman Osborn felt pretty different here. Aunt May and Peter both take pity on him, and in this film, it makes total sense that they would. He's depicted as a flawed but ultimately innocent man whose mind has been hijacked by a monster. In Spider-Man 1, that feels a bit less clear-cut to me. Like the Goblin and Norman weren't two completely different entities, but simply part of Norman's brain telling him to do the things he knew he wanted to do and now had the power to do anyway. Like when he plays that trick at the end of the first movie where he pretends to want Peter's help to try to set him up to get murdered by the glider, I never thought of it as, oh, the Goblin is in full control here. More that both sides of himself were working in tandem to get what he wants, because Norman Osborn is a pretty terrible person. But I can also see how this film's take on Norman could still work with the continuity of what came before. So I'm curious to see what you think. Did they significantly change the characterization of Norman here, or was I misreading Spider-Man 1 all along?
Well, sequel time already, huh? Welcome back, I guess. I'm sure you miss me more than I missed you. Anyway, things have changed around here since last time, so...
Electro, Sandman, and the Lizard are also here, but they aren't given quite as much to do as Doc Ock and the Goblin. Max Dillon is just a completely different person, something that's acknowledged in the text of the film, that they dropped all the nerdy aspects of the character and just let Jamie Foxx play Jamie Foxx. I mean, you could really even say that Electro's whole motivation here is that he wants to stay in the universe where he's as cool as Jamie Foxx and isn't a blue guy who used to have a bad comb over. I've always hated the Amazing Spider-Man Lizard design, and I wish they had just redesigned him here like they did for Electro, but I know this take on the character does have its fans. Sandman seemed to have the least to do, but I really enjoyed his back and forths with Holland Spider-Man, which I wasn't really expecting. As for harsher criticisms, while I'm usually not the YouTube channel to go to if you want really in-depth analysis of a movie's visual language, I will say that some of the CG here just looked pretty rushed, especially in the third act. And while I wasn't expecting it at this point, John Watts' direction still lacks the inventive camera movement of Sam Raimi. I don't think any filmmaker has quite been able to capture the joy of web swinging like he did. This will be a deal breaker for some, and I get that, but I think the strength of the performances and the narrative is more than enough to overcome that here. And to be fair, there is some really fun Spider-Man action. I especially like some of the web-based attacks that felt straight out of Spider-Man PS4. This is a movie that remembers that Spider-Man can hit like a ton of bricks when he wants to, and Holland's Peter is now confident enough in his own ability that it doesn't shy away from that. Aunt May's death in the film is one of the things that took me genuinely by surprise. How it was staged was maybe not the best. It seemed like she should have been instantly killed by the glider, but then is able to stand up and have a conversation before dying. I think that's probably beside the point though, because the movie brings it where it counts. The camera really lingers on Holland's face there, in a way that reminded me of the scene when he's trapped under the rubble in Homecoming. And I think in both cases, it really proves he's up to the task of handling these moments, not just the light MCU jokes. May telling him the iconic Spider-Man motto before his death shouldn't work as well as it does, but I think the movie gets away with it because of the performances and because this iteration of the character has held off on that line for so long. Just taken on its own, I think that would be a pretty emotionally affecting death scene. But I think the movie also does a good job of having May's words there inform Peter's choice in the third act. I gotta say, I often really have issues with the last act of Marvel movies, especially in things like Black Widow, where any unique flavor that the movie has goes out the window, and directors tend to just kinda go through the motions. But I think No Way Home has one that works. It reminded me a lot of Buffy's season 5 finale, The Gift. Partly because they're both battles that involve a bunch of scaffolding and the sky breaking open as beings from other realities pour in. But more importantly, it's where Buffy has to make a terrible sacrifice in order to stop it. Before I really get into what that choice means for Peter though, I should probably talk about Ned and MJ. I think this is Zendaya's best turn as MJ, easily. I always thought she was solid in the role, but she didn't have all that much to play. Here, we get to see more of her life outside of school. Things like her crappy job at the donut shop really help her feel like a more fleshed out character, not just a quip machine. I would have liked to have more of that stuff, honestly, but I'm at least happy with what we got here. She gets to drop her wall of indifferent sarcasm a bit more, which I think was really needed. They finally give her a lot more than one note to play here, and I think she played it well. And while these films may rely on easy Ned punchlines a bit too often, overall I continue to just really like this trio. While these two were never the most complex characters, they're really engaging performances, and the past two movies really helped the final minutes of this one work as well as they do. When I talk about things like Spider-Man, Buffy, or even just sci-fi and fantasy genre fiction in general, things like the choice that Peter Parker makes at the end of this movie are some of the moments that I value most. I mean, the idea that Peter has to tell Doctor Strange to have everyone forget who he is in order to save the world is ridiculous. It's the kind of broad operatic storytelling that can only happen in fiction that's this heightened and this over the top. It takes a fear and feeling that everyone can relate to, like what if I was completely alone, what if no one cared about me at all, and blows it up to literal cosmic proportions. That gives so much weight to this third act and really elevates the film above a lot of other superhero movies in my mind. Peter's choice made me think about not just the famous Spider-Man line that Aunt May said earlier in the film, but something said during the climax of Spider-Man 2 as well.
To do what's right, we have to be steady and give up the thing we want the most, even our dreams.
The idea that personal sacrifice is what makes Spider-Man heroic, far more than his powers, is something that I've always found really compelling about the character. And I'm glad it was emphasized here, at the end of this trilogy, in the most comic book way possible. That ending serves a few functions. It does address a lot of the problems that people had with this Spider-Man. Long gone is the billionaire's best little buddy, leading a comfortable life. He's isolated and moving into an apartment that looks like the one from the recent Spider-Man games. I think the new costume is great, and him sewing it together himself was a nice touch. It promises a very different status quo for Holland's Spider-Man, one filled with possibilities. And you know what, I'm just going to throw it out here that maybe the next film can involve Matt Murdock more than this one did. I think where Peter is now works really well for a full Daredevil crossover movie. In the end though, I'm just glad that they pulled off this story as well as they did. There were a lot of moving parts to this movie, a lot of fan servicey elements that could have fell flat, and definitely a line here and there that did. But the core of this film is exactly the kind of Spider-Man story I love. And that, more than anything, is what I'll take away from No Way Home.
With Spider-Man 3 action figures and vehicles, the web-slinging excitement never ends. You can take out Sandman.
This movie obviously called back to the superhero films of the 2000s a lot, movies I love talking about. So much that I actually have a whole video on Ang Lee's Hulk up right now on my streaming service, Nebula. What I love about Nebula is it's creator-driven first, so things like YouTube's algorithm, ads, and bots just aren't an issue there. I've uploaded a bunch of exclusive videos there, on everything from Hulk to Rick and Morty to Cheers, and I'm far from alone, since it features creators like Nando V Movies, Patrick H. Willems, H. Bomber Guy, and so many others. And the best part is, it's bundled in with an amazing documentary streaming service, Curiosity Stream. This month, I've been going back to Becoming Martian, a great series about the history of our fascination with the red planet. You combine the history docs with Curiosity Stream documentaries on science, nature, and tech, and you have a great offer. So sign up to Curiosity Stream and you'll receive an email welcoming you to Nebula as well. If you're watching this on or before Christmas Eve, you're in for an amazing deal. Right now, the annual plan is 42% off. If you're watching it after though, you're still in for a great deal, because you can get both services for just $14.79 for an entire year. So sign up now by going to curiositystream.com/captainmidnight. That's curiositystream.com/captainmidnight.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once, because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started, because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.